So we're going to end this chapter with talking about prejudice and discrimination. And unfortunately, and I do say unfortunately, this is not a new subject for any of us. We live in a world that really seems to be full of discrimination and prejudice. Sometimes it's about skin color, sometimes it's about religion, race, sex, gender. It's about a lot of different things. And so I want to address that today. And this isn't going to be a long lecture, but you are going to watch a video in it. So you're going to need to have a little bit of time for that. But again, I hope that you're open-minded as we just talk about the subject. It can be an uncomfortable subject. It should be an uncomfortable subject. And so let's just go forward. Okay, so what is the difference between discrimination and prejudice? Well, prejudice is the negative attitude held by a person about members of a particular social group. And if you watched the last slideshow, you saw we talked about attitude and how we form those attitudes. So how do people become prejudiced towards another social group? Well, a lot of times maybe it's how you were raised. Maybe family members spoke negatively about a different race or religion or culture or something. Sometimes, again, it's through that maybe you had an interaction with an individual, and now that individual represents a whole people. And so we end up forming these attitudes, and the attitude itself is what a prejudice is. Discrimination, on the other hand, is when it's our behavior, it's our action. It's when we actually treat people differently because of the prejudice towards a social group to which that person belongs. Now, oops, I thought there was one more piece to that. Okay, so here's one thing, though, to also know. We have what's called in-groups and out-groups. And this can also be, this doesn't even have to be race, religion, anything like that, but sometimes it is. An in-group is a social group with whom a person identifies. It's the us. The them is who you don't identify with. So maybe when you were in high school, we talked about, social categories. Maybe you fit into a certain social category or a social group, and that's who you hung out with. But when you looked at the other people at school, they were the thems. Well, you now have an official term for this. Your group was your in-group, and everybody else were the out-groups. Once an in-group is established, prejudice towards and discriminatory treatment of the out-group soon follows, or I'm going to specify can soon follow. It doesn't have to be that way, but often it is. Members of the out-groups are usually going to become stereotyped according to some superficial characteristic. Like skin color, hair color. You see where I'm going here, I'm pretty sure. There's a thing called realistic conflict theory. Again, everybody has a theory in psychology, and of course this has many. But it says that prejudice and discrimination will be increased between groups that are in conflict over limited resources. Well, we've seen this to be true over history. I'll give you some examples. The Jews and the Germans. So if you did not take world history, let me just review, or maybe you did, but you need a review. Remember, World War II was actually started because how did Hitler come into play here? He was really good at selling something. He sold the German people a bill of goods that said the reason they were poor, which was really from World War II or World War I, was because of the Jewish people. That they were the ones holding all the money. Well, because the Jewish people were really good business owners and very good business people. And so they did have thriving businesses. Were they all rich in what our terms of rich would be today? Not at all. But the Germans were just so very poor. And so the Jewish people had, the Germans had not. So the Germans became the in group for Hitler, and the Jewish people became the out group. Their limited resource? Well, that was the money. How about Native Americans and colonists? What did Native Americans have that colonists wanted? Land. And so another example. Okay, this is the video I was telling you about. Due to a time in history, I just want to give you a warning. When this experiment was done, of course, they were using some slang for African Americans that are used by children in this. We do not condone such slang, but I just want to give you that heads up. This is a video that I want you to watch. It's called Brown-Eyed, Blue-Eyed. Actually, the video itself is called A Class Divided. But it was an experiment done by a woman named, her last name was Elliott. I can't remember her first name right now, but Jane Elliott, I think. And she, as you're going to see, she divides her class by eye color, brown eyes, blue eyes. The first day, she's going to tell her, I believe her brown-eyed kids, that they are lesser than. They are the out group. The blue-eyed kids, they are the in group. The next day, she switches it around. This is going to be a long video, so actually, I'm going to have you go ahead and pause this video that we're watching right now and go to the one right below this video on the page to watch the actual frontline video. It is about, I think, 54 minutes long. Really, really interesting, though. It's very interesting. And so just go ahead and pause this and then come back. And we're actually going to talk about this during our next Zoom meeting. And so be prepared for that. But yeah, I hope that you enjoy this video because, again, it's a very informative. So I hope that you enjoyed that video. Again, I find it to be one that's very interesting. I want you to, though, answer a couple of questions for me. So the first one, is there anything about this experiment that you find disturbing? We'll talk more about these questions when we get together on Zoom later this week. But the first, that's a good question to ask. Is there anything that's disturbing? And how do you think adults might react in a similar experiment? Now, she kind of does that later on in the video, as you saw. How do you think you would react in this experiment? The next question is, are there any ethical concerns about what Elliot did in her classroom? And what kind of changes might have occurred in the personalities and performances of the children if the experiment had continued for more than 2 days in each group? That would be really interesting. I can't wait to hear your responses when we get together, but let's move on. Okay, so a person or group, typically of an out group, who serves as the target of the frustrations and negative emotions of members of the in-group, this is called scapegoating. That term actually comes from ancient Jewish tradition where they would send a goat out into the wilderness with the symbolic sins of the people on its head. Again, a scapegoat. But there have been a lot of times that we, as a people, throughout history, we want to blame others for a problem, a frustration, a negative. In politics today, right? Democrats all, what do? They blame the Republicans. What do the Republicans do? They blame the Democrats. We use each other as a scapegoat for what the problems of our society are. There's been a lot of, I have in the example here, the 1992 Los Angeles Riots. Most of you were not even born yet. You were not even on your parents' radar yet. However, when this occurred, it occurred because a police officer, he was found, or a group of policemen were found not guilty in the beating of an African-American guy by the name of Rodney King. After that came down, there were riots throughout LA. However, were there riots against policemen? No. Were they against African Americans? No. They actually ended up being in the Asian community, which had nothing to do with any of the story, but that is where the major riots took place. So again, asking that question, how do people learn prejudice? Well, social cognitive theory says that prejudice is formed as other attitudes are formed, like I said kind of earlier, through just direct instruction, sometimes modeling behavior, and other social influences on learning. So again, we might pick it up from other people who've told us, this certain group of people, well, they're bad, or there's something about them we don't like, or that instruction comes directly from somebody. Also, then the other theory on this is called social identity theory. That says 3 processes are responsible for the formation of a person's identity within a certain social group. The first one is social categorization. You actually have to put yourself and put the other person into social categories. The next one is you have to identify with one of those categories, right? You have to figure out who you are in the grand scheme of things. And the last part is then we end up comparing. It's basically the in-group, out-group scenario. My in-group, your out-group. What's the difference between us? Why do I identify with my in-group, and why do I think that my in-group is better than your out-group? So, another thing to think about is stereotype vulnerability. The effect of people's awareness of the stereotypes associated with their social group and how that awareness has an effect on their behavior. Sometimes it feels like people don't do themselves any favors, right? They may participate in a behavior or do something, well, because they were told they do it anyway, so why not? And so just being very aware of that. Okay, self-fulfilling prophecy is the tendency of one's expectations to affect one's behavior in such a way as to make the expectation more likely. Again, hey, you tell me I'm a bad person, I might as well be a bad person. You tell me I'm going to do this, I might as well do it. If you say that I come from people who are violent, then I might as well be violent. And I may make choices that directly help fulfill that. How do we overcome prejudice? Well, believe it or not, it's more simple than you would ever realize. The first way is just through learning. It's through education, learning about people who are different from you in many ways. I like to tell a story about when in my office at one point, I put up a Christmas tree during the holiday season. Well, I had a girl come in who was Islamic in faith. And so when we went into session, I asked her, hey, are you offended by this? And she had the best response. She goes, you know what? If we can't learn about each other's cultures, how will we ever overcome the stereotypes and the prejudices? And so she sat there and she asked me about my Christmas tree. Did my ornaments have special meaning to me? What were the traditions of my family? And we learned from each other. And that intergroup contact is actually one of the best ways. It's direct contact with people from different backgrounds. Usually we'll find common ground to build friendships and knowledge of each other's cultures, ethnic and religious differences. It is the best way to realize that, you know what, we are all in this human thing together, no matter what our belief system is, no matter what the color of our skin might be, or the race that we come from. That intergroup contact, we can usually find some commonalities. We also have what's called equal status contact. So contact between groups in which the groups have equal status. Neither group has power over the other. There's also a learning technique that is called the Jigsaw Classroom. It's an educational technique in which individuals are only given part of the information needed to solve a problem, causing the separate individuals to be forced to work together to find the solution. If you've ever watched Survivor, a lot of times they have these puzzle things they have to put together, or they used to. I haven't watched it in years, but they used to have these puzzles that they'd have to put together, but everybody would have to work together. Everybody had equal status, and everybody had to play a part in doing that. And that actually helped them congeal as a team a lot of times, because you did have people who came from such diverse backgrounds. Well, that is the end of Prejudice and Discrimination. And I wish that I could tell you that it was truly the end of Prejudice and Discrimination. But unfortunately, in our world and our society, I don't know that there will ever be an end to that, because it just seems to continue to breed and to grow. And but you know what? We as individuals can take responsibility, and we can make a difference. Probably one of the best museums I've ever been to in my whole life. It really struck me in my heart. Was called the Museum of Tolerance. It's down in LA. And when I went, the museum itself had been given a grant that they could bring educators to their museum and put them through a 2-day program. The first day, they flew us down, and this was when I worked at elementary school. Every employee of the elementary school went. Everybody from the custodians to counselors to teachers to secretaries and principals. Everybody was flown down to Southern California. We, of course, went through the museum, but then we went across the street to a classroom setting where they brought in individuals who had definitely experienced discrimination in their lifetime. If you've ever heard of the Little Rock Nine, there was a member of the Little Rock Nine. If you haven't, they're the individuals. They were African American, and at the time we had segregated schools. They were escorted. The segregation basically in schools was outlawed, and so these 9 students were brought into an all-white high school. They had to be escorted by the National Guard to get to school every day. There were protesters. There was so much hate towards these 9 high schoolers who just wanted to go to school. And so one of those men came in and talked to us. Now that he's a man, we had a child survivor of Auschwitz, the concentration camp. He now was an old man, but he still had the tattoo on his arm of his number, and he told what that was like. We had an ex-skinhead come and talk to us. Again, these people were fascinating in just what their perspective was, going through some of the most horrific things of discrimination or being a discriminator. And so learned so much from that process. It starts with us. So I hope that you got something out of this. Again, if you didn't have a chance to go back and watch the video of Brown Eye, Blue Eye, please do so and be ready for our Zoom meeting later this week. Okay? We'll talk to you soon. Bye.